Hey, welcome to this week's edition of the Redemption Recap. My name is Steven. I'm your host. I'm joined today in studio by Kayla.
Hello.
We're glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in.
Welcome to the Redemption Recap, reminding you of what is happening here at Redemption. Here is today's episode.
So today, we are going to do a couple of things. We're going to recap this last weekend, which was another great weekend at Redemption Church.
Sure was.
And then we're going to take a deeper dive into the topic of suffering. So we didn't suffer enough this weekend. We're going to continue on.
Love that for us.
Yes, and happy 4th of July weekend, everybody.
Yeah.
Weekend. It's really in the middle of the week.
It is.
It's a little different because it always feels like a holiday should be on the weekend.
But it's nice when it's not because then you get a weekday off.
I know, right in the middle of the week. Everybody's excited.
Yeah.
This is great. So another good weekend at church.
Yep.
We just wrapped up VBS.
Yes.
You were there each of the 4 nights?
I was.
Yeah. How was it?
It was so fun. We had I think an average of 180 kids each night. The whole camp theme was so fun. They all had little water bottles that had stickers like Happy Camper and stuff on it. It was a really good time. The crafts, the games, everything was so cute.
It was adorable. And I liked walking in. I picked up my kids, obviously, at the end, dropped them off. They were happy. Everybody else was happy. The parents were super happy.
Yeah.
So awesome job to all the volunteers, Jen, and the rest of the staff for the incredible work done. Let's see, what else did we talk about this weekend?
We did announce that a new partnership track is going to be starting.
Yes.
So July.
Which you lead.
I lead.
So give everyone the quick rundown. What's the partnership track?
Cool.
And who's it for?
Partnership track is basically answering the questions of, do I want to stay here at Redemption and how do I engage here? So we go through our values, our vision, our core doctrine. We talk about spiritual growth. What does it look like for you to facilitate it for yourself? How do we as the church partner with you to encourage your spiritual growth? We go through different topics like connecting relationally, serving purposefully, giving generously, and sharing intentionally. It's a really great way to kind of figure out how to move further into knowing more people here, being a bigger part of the church. The end goal is basically to help communicate how do you partner with Redemption in the gospel. And so it's really fun. We have a good time. There's always a lot of laughter, but it's also really intentional. And it kind of takes away the pressure of making new friends in a sanctuary of 400 people to a smaller classroom of people, get to know some people, find some friendly faces. So you can sign up now on our website, or you can find me in the lobby at church, and we would love to have you a part of it. It's always a good time. I always joke that it's one of my favorite parts of my job, and I didn't think it was going to be like that because before I started working here, I did not like talking in front of people. And so
Here you are on our podcast.
Here I am.
Every week.
How fun.
Yay! We're so excited about it. So partnership track, they can sign up on the website.
Yep.
It's 7 weeks.
Yep.
And it'll be going on during the 9 o'clock service, correct?
Correct.
So the idea is, and who it's for is really anyone who's relatively new to the church.
Yep.
Or anyone who hasn't gone through it.
Yep.
I mean, we kind of focus on new people, but if you've been around for a long time, you haven't gone through it, we highly recommend it.
We do.
You'll get to know some new people, and we will help you get connected. We want to be really good at helping people grow spiritually and get connected,
Yep.
and partnership track is one of the best ways to do it.
Agreed.
So let's see, we had partnership track, we had VBS this weekend. We also talked about Clear Truth Media.
Big deal.
Yeah, real big deal. On Monday, July 1st, Clear Truth Media launched. So this is a website, and just the brief story. We did a series called Clear Truth for a Confused World about 2 years ago. That series turned into a conference. That conference is turning into a conference tour, and then all of that is turning into cleartruthmedia.com. So they can check it out today. It's live. But we did clarify a couple of things.
Yep.
Clear Truth Media is not like a Redemption production. Redemption doesn't own Clear Truth Media. We're certainly involved.
Yep.
Our staff, myself, other people are involved in the project, but the church doesn't own it. It's a separate entity, different legally, all of that kind of stuff. And also different from like a governing perspective.
Yeah.
This is not like an elder or a pastor thing. It is its own entity run by a group of people, some that go to our church, some that don't.
Yep.
And there's like over 40 contributors, which is awesome, a growing list. It's post-denominational. There's going to be people on there you agree with, some you don't agree with. That's fine. We can always get better. But you won't see heresy, and you won't see liberalism on it.
Whoop, whoop.
Yep. The two. Well, I repeat myself, but you won't see those two things on there. And what you will see is a lot of really good articles, videos, podcasts, sermons from people all across the country that believe the Bible just like we do here. So really cool.
Yes.
So that you can check it out if you haven't already. Clear Truth Media. You can subscribe. It's like $10 a month. It's really not about the content. It's just about a donation and supporting the cause, which we've already had lots of people do.
It's exciting.
I know, it is. It's really fun. And we'll see where God takes it next.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do today, we're going to go 5 steps deeper into suffering.
Yes.
So how fun is that? Because we haven't suffered enough. And we kind of laid out this weekend, I laid out this weekend, 6 ways that Romans 8 pulls suffering out.
Yep.
And then also 4 things that we can do about it.
Yep.
So as much as we can, we're going to try to kind of go deeper into those today. But in general, when you think of suffering, Kayla, as we began to work through this, and the topic of suffering, what comes to mind?
Outside of working for you, I would say that's my current biggest.
Wow.
Just kidding. I feel like suffering
For everyone out there who feels sorry for me for having to take the type of abuse that I take from Kayla each and every week on this podcast, I appreciate your prayers, your thoughts, your flowers, your cards, your Skittles, your non-orange Starburst. Thank
if
you.
If you know Stephen at all, you know
what do you know, Kayla?
What he receives, he gives back in tenfold, like a little gift.
Never. Okay, continue on with your suffering rant.
Suffering. I think that suffering tends to be, at least in my mind, when I'm trying to define it for myself, it's anything that starts to like trip me up in something, right? So it could be like something negative happened. It could be a hardship that happens. It could be something that makes me question my identity in Christ. It's really anything that's like causing pause in my life that could give the opportunity to walk away from my faith or allow me to move closer into it.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. So I think 5 thoughts that come through when you think about suffering in the faith. The first one would be this: what if I don't suffer? Does that mean I'm not a Christian? And I think it's a natural conclusion. In fact, you were kind of telling a story about that on a mission trip when you were a kid.
Yeah.
Why don't you use that as a setup for this part?
Sure. The first time that I went to Africa with my parents, I was 15, I think, and we had went, and I was talking to someone
there. Did they
there.
plan on leaving you there?
I think so. Yeah, the hardship was too much for them.
Your parents suffering.
Here we are. And I was talking to someone from there, and they had asked me this question of, can you tell me about your suffering that you've experienced? And I'm 15. And
15-year-old.
And my outlook on life is very optimistic. And I was like, I don't know. I can't think of anything like off the top of my head. Like I could think of like little things, but not like great sufferings.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, well then you actually aren't in a place to proclaim the gospel. And I was like, as a 15-year-old,
wow.
I was like a little wrecked by that because I'm like at the peak. I'm so excited. This is like my first trip. And I'm like, I don't know, I'm very excited. And then I was crushed. I went to my mom. I'm like, I can't talk about Jesus because I haven't suffered.
Yeah. So what is the response when someone says, well, what are your sufferings? And if you're not suffering, or if people were in the crowd yesterday and thinking to themselves as I'm talking, well, I haven't faced any of this. Does that mean I'm not a Christian? I think there's a couple of answers. So I'll give the first one.
Okay.
The first one might be yes. Yes, and the fact that maybe you aren't in Christ, and it is a good thing to evaluate that if your faith has never cost you anything, then there might be something to explore there. Our Christian faith should cost us something, right? And forever going, through the motions or always being considered on the right side of every issue, right? When you talk to somebody who isn't a Christian and they're like, oh no, you're one of those Christians who gets it. Well, maybe you're getting it is you being ashamed of the gospel or not standing for truth. So I do think there is something in there, but maybe another way of looking at it for those who are genuine in Christ, I was thinking this. Paul talks about his sufferings. Jesus obviously says you will have suffering and tribulation, but he doesn't say you will always have it.
Yeah.
It doesn't even say that you should look for it. It just says that it will be. And I think that just because in the present moment, you might not be weighed down by suffering, doesn't mean that it won't exist sometime in the future.
Yeah. And I think, too, something I was saying to you that I find interesting is sometimes when you are experiencing suffering, it feels like the deepest thing that you've experienced in that moment. And then time and space happens, and God brings his healing to a situation, and you can look back and you can recognize that suffering took place, but it's in a very different light than when you were in the middle of experiencing it. There's a new perspective that comes. And so the depth of the hurt or the depth of the like emotions that was originally tied to the suffering isn't the same as what it is now that you've gotten further into your future.
Yeah, I think about the three of the four types of suffering we talked about yesterday: family breakdown,
Yep.
Ministry struggle or hardship, and insults. And when you begin to think suffering through that lens, I think it's easier to see how this can be present in our lives,
Yep.
right? Whether it's the breakdown of a friend. I mean, I look back now, kind of what you were just saying. There was a time when I had like a major breakdown in my friendships,
Yeah.
and I look back now and go, oh wow, those friendships broke down because there were certain things that I wasn't willing to do that they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it at the time, but that was, it was because of obedience to the word of God. And that was a form of suffering. It was painful. It hurt, right, to lose that group of friends. And I can look back now and go, that's what it is to follow Christ. And so sometimes you're right. We may not see it in the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one idea with suffering. A second question that I think that comes up with suffering is there's a lot of talk in the scriptures about Christ's burden being light, particularly in Matthew, and then also all the benefits like the life, the abundant life.
Yeah.
And so, how do you like understand the maybe a contradiction between life that is truly life and I've come that they may have the abundant life versus suffering in a sermon like yesterday?
Yeah, I think you use this verse fairly often where it talks about those who reap in tears, or those who sow in tears will reap in shouts of joy. And how the Bible also talks that there are seasons for things, right? So talking about an abundant life doesn't mean that every single second of your life feels like it's to the brim with blessing, right? There are seasons that it ebbs and flows. But we recognize that even in the midst of our suffering, which I know we're going to kind of hop into this next week, there's a hope that's coming.
Yep.
And that's the thing that still lets us be able to live abundantly, even in the midst of our suffering. I know I was saying, I just think Romans is so rich just in general.
Yep.
And I always like how in Romans 5, it talks about how and those who, knowing that tribulation will bring perseverance will produce proven character will then bring hope, and hope does not disappoint. And how that's like something that we cling on to. It isn't always fun when our character is being refined.
Right.
But that proven character then bringing the hope for the future glory that's to come, that's the thing that grounds us to still live abundantly in the season that doesn't quite feel like it's overflowing.
Yeah, there's also the principle of like easy come, easy go applies in everything in life, and to an extent in our spiritual journey as well. I think there's when life is only good, it's kind of easy to look and say, yes, like Christianity is great, but the moment something goes a little wrong, we go, Jesus, where are you?
Yeah.
Where when your faith has come through difficult journeys, it takes way more to then shake you off of that faith.
Definitely.
Because you're like, wow, Christ has held me in these tough moments.
Yeah.
And now that I've faced a new tough moment, like that's not going to faze me.
Definitely.
Those who sow in tears will reap with shouts of joy.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's just interesting to think through the ebbs and flows of the seasons and stuff. And I know one thing that we were talking about, another question that kind of came up when we were looking at this topic of suffering is being able to distinguish between moments of suffering and consequences of sin.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I think that sin leads to death, right? And sin always leads to death in a practical or a spiritual. And I know in 1 John it says there is a sin that doesn't lead to death. What that's talking about is sin that doesn't lead to eternal death. Well, that's sin that's covered by Christ. But our sin leads to practical death, right? A little leaven leavens the whole lump. It's always going to move its way through our world.
Yeah.
And so there is natural consequences to our sin.
Yeah.
And that is, you could say, well, is that the suffering that I was talking about in point 6 yesterday, right? Just life being difficult. Well, to some extent, yes, but I wouldn't say that's necessarily Christian suffering because it's Everyone sits under the weight of sin,
Yeah.
right? And there is a level of life just being hard because we live in a broken world, and we understand it differently because we're in the spirit and
Yeah.
we're longing for something that we know is coming, that we've already tasted,
Yeah.
right? It's like when you take a bite of something, now you're hungry, right? When you've had a bite of a foretaste of the Holy Spirit, now you're longing for that perfection.
Yeah.
Where I think it's tragic for people who haven't. They don't even know what they're longing for.
Yeah.
So anyway, where I was going with that is there are the natural consequences of sin that sometimes we go, oh, I'm suffering. Well, no, you're living out the consequences of your sin. Now, here's what I think they can intersect. When you respond to your sin in a Christian way, now there is an element of suffering that the world doesn't know because it doesn't respond to their sin through a repentive and a Christian way.
Yeah. A lot of times the idea of like crucifying your flesh,
Yep.
getting rid of like those big sin things that are holding you down, it often isn't easy because of worldly perspectives, because of culture, because you're going like against the grain. And that's where the like suffering can then hop in,
Yep.
because it's like, well, now if I'm choosing to crucify this part of sin in my life, are there friends that I'm going to lose? Are there people that are going to walk out? It can create a domino effect as you start to move further towards righteousness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say this too, like maybe another practical example. Sometimes people will be in a bad financial position and like, I'm just suffering right now. Well, no, you're not actually suffering in this Christian sense. You might have been stupid, and being stupid makes life hard. Right?
That
Like
is true.
life's tough. It's tougher when you're dumb.
Yeah.
And so don't use spiritual language to make yourself feel better on what practical knowledge could solve.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have any money, but you've been employed, right, and you've been spending your money in a foolish way, again, that's not Christian suffering. You don't get heaven brownie points for that.
Yeah.
What you do is you live out the natural consequences of your actions, right?
Yep.
You could apply this to your health. Sometimes you could apply it to your friendships. Now, this kind of gives us into a different topic that we're going to talk about, which was how do you avoid a suffering mindset versus a victim mentality?
That one's a hard one because I feel like a lot of times we talk about suffering being temporary, but sometimes seasons of suffering are long.
They can last a long time.
Yep. I think the longer the suffering is, oftentimes the easier it is to fall into a victim mentality. When suffering is real quick and you like hop into it and hop out of it really fast, it's really easy to like, move on. I'm to the other side of it. It's great. I think that it's a lot harder when you've been held in a season of suffering. And I think one of the easiest ways to not let yourself get into that victim mentality is really who you're choosing to spend time with.
Yeah.
Because it's really hard to be in a victim mentality when you are surrounded by Christians who are grounded in the Word of God that are going to hold you accountable for your thoughts and your actions. And I think that victim mentality is really easy to fall into, and it can be really easy to not be self-aware that you've fallen into it. So you do have to have people who can say, that remind you of the hope, remind you that like it's an opportunity for your character to be proven, remind you to persevere, or stand with you and help hold up your arms, right, until you get through the season of it.
I think it's helpful to say, well, what do we mean by victim mentality? So victim mentality is taking on like this, not a guilt complex, but a complex of woe is me that is somehow unfair or unparalleled. Nobody gets it like I do.
Yeah.
No one ever faces things like I do, right? I've used this example before, and some people, might find it offensive, but that's not out of par with lots of things I say. So
fair.
Right. Yeah. But sometimes like you'll see somebody and they'll be in the exact same situation as somebody else, but they have a victim mentality. And so like I'll use this example. A mom of 3 will say to another mom of 3, I just can't be a mom of 3.
Yeah.
Saying it to a mom of 3, that's like, well, I have literally the same experience as you do, and can be choosing joy, right, in this as opposed to the, overwhelming the victim mentality.
Yeah.
A guy can say, well, it's just so hard to work in this world. Well, it's hard equally in everyone to work and to create a living. And so it's, how am I going to respond?
Yeah.
And what am I going to do? And we live in a world that doesn't want people to take individual responsibility.
Yeah.
And our Christian faith should always compel us to take individual responsibility.
Yep.
And to not blame, things out there, but to
Yep.
look inside and say, well, what can I do to change this? And so that victim mentality, when we enter into then a legitimate sense or a season of suffering, there, it can slide into sin, I believe, when we take on a victim mentality.
I think a victim mentality too can oftentimes be like an easy gateway into like bitterness
Yep.
and unforgiveness, and those are sins. And
Yeah.
so you have to like be
We
really
can use
cautious.
it as an excuse to sin.
Yes. And oftentimes, I think something for me when it comes to victim mentality is that it's almost you saying that because of the suffering you're enduring, you are no longer held responsible to be an image bearer of Christ or to partner in the gospel.
Yeah, it's a really great way of saying it.
And that's where it becomes like a little shaky, is that like in all seasons of life, we are still responsible image bearers of Christ. And in all seasons of life, we're still to be partners in the gospel with him.
And to be joyful.
And so if you can't walk out those two in the midst of your suffering, it might be time that you bring someone else in and have a real heart-to-heart conversation about how you need to be able to get out of the cycle that you're in right now.
Yeah.
And you might need someone to give you a hand up out of it, or you might already know, oh, I need to make these changes in my day-to-day.
Yeah, that's really good. Let's stop there and hit that one more time for everybody. So you were saying there's two things that can disrupt people's proper perspective,
Yeah.
right? Or to take on a victim mentality.
Yeah.
Number one, I no longer have to bear the image of Christ
Yep.
because of what happened to me.
Correct.
Number two, I don't have to partner in the gospel because of what happened to me
Yes.
or my circumstances.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good. And it's easy. Our world tells us this, right? Over and over. Oh my gosh, that happened. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, you have to work for Stephen. Like, you don't have to, have the fruit of the Spirit anymore, right? And we make these excuses for
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah.
Or we stop partnering,
Yeah.
right? And we use seasons to go, well, I need a break from partnering in the gospel.
Yeah.
Right? And I think Paul was getting at that a little bit in 1 Corinthians 11. It's like, listen, guys, if anyone deserves a break, it's me. Like, look at what has happened to
Yep.
me. Yet I still keep going because what else is there?
Yeah.
Why else am I here?
Yeah.
Right? And what's the verse where he says, I always get this one backwards, but for me to live is Christ, and
Yep.
to die is gain. Right? So if I'm going to be alive,
Yep.
if I'm not dead,
Yep.
then I'm going to keep being used by Christ.
Yeah.
And so I never get to stop partnering in the gospel.
Exactly.
Yeah. How do you repent from a victim mentality?
I think if we're talking about victim mentality in like the sense of the different things we were just saying in terms of like the natural outpourings of a victim mentality, I think you can start first with the bitterness, the unforgiveness,
Yeah.
the fact that you haven't been a good image bearer of Christ, the fact that you haven't chose to partner with the gospel, right? And then part of repenting is turning back, which means have a game plan to not be doing those things anymore. And sometimes, I know we talked about this, I think we talked about this maybe in the last podcast, but maybe if bitterness has been your go-to place, then you need to look up a verse in the Bible and
Yeah.
you need to start each day with reminding yourself about what it looks like to walk in holiness. And you're going to make a choice every morning. Today, I'm going to choose not to be bitter. So if that thought pops into my head, I'm going to choose to take it captive and I'm going to speak this verse over my life.
Yeah.
And so you can get real practical with it sometimes.
I think of Philippians 3:14 too, when he says, I forget what lies behind and I press on.
Yeah.
And forgetting what lies behind, trying to understand in proper context what Paul means there. And with all of this is in no way downplaying hurt, pain, or mourning.
No.
All of those things are real. We just went through that.
Yep.
Suffering is real. It hurts. But how do I operate? And I tell people who come to me, from a pastoral perspective and talk about a difficult season that they're going in, that more than what happened, what they did,
Yeah.
what matters now is how they walk through it. And the integrity that they show, and I will say this again, showing integrity in the midst of difficulty is in part a Christian suffering, because so many non-Christians will face a difficult season and they will allow themselves to get bitter and angry, and it's like it's a form of medicine that makes us feel better in the moment, right? Or you turn to things like, whatever, alcohol or drug or sex or consumerism or any type of material, flesh-driven way to satisfy. I think it's 4:7. You put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. And it's how it's running to the things of the world, right, to satisfy me. And he's saying, no, you give me that, right? And so suffering from a Christ perspective, a Christian perspective, or persevering is a form of suffering. But going back to the verse you pointed out, what does that produce? Character. Right? And it refines us. Okay, one last thing. How do we joyfully suffer?
That one is a hard one, I think. Because it seems contrary to, you're like, I'm going through this deeply sad thing or this deeply emotional thing, and it almost feels fake to put on your smile. And when we say joyfully suffer, we're not saying you should put on a facade for the people around you.
Or be flippant about non-flippant things.
That's not at all what we're saying. But we bring up this verse all the time. I bring up this verse all the time. I think the number one thing is taking time to be in his presence. Because the Bible does promise that in his presence there is fullness of joy. And so sometimes it's like, I know for me, if I am in a day, and this, I know this isn't suffering, so I'm not saying this is exactly the same, but if I'm in a day where I'm in a particularly bad mood, I have specific worship songs that I will play that will remind me who I am and who God is. And sometimes that's just enough. Like I need to remind myself for a second that my current anger, my current frustration, it's temporary. His glory is eternal. And it is my job to steward today in a way that still brings him glory. And sometimes that just fixes it enough, at least for me.
Well, it's like that when people say, how do I know God's will? I'm like, just start doing what you know you're supposed to be doing, and it'll begin to reveal itself, right? How do I joyfully suffer? Go through today and be obedient. Joyful are people of integrity who follow the instructions of the Lord, right? Joy in the presence of the Lord. So there's two promises right there. How do I become joyful again? Obey, have integrity, right, and be in his presence. That joy will naturally come out of those things, even in the midst of difficulty. I think the third thing I would think of is just the promise. In James, when it says consider it pure joy, it's tying that directly back to what? Because it will prove the genuine nature of your faith. It will prove the genuine nature of your faith because you don't run from your faith just because something bad has happened. It'll also prove the genuine nature of your faith because in those difficult seasons, what is in you will come out. Right.
And I think too, one of the things that can squelch joy in a given day is thinking about tomorrow and the next day and Saturday and Sunday and as you get onto the week and the what ifs that come. And it's biblical to not borrow worries for tomorrow because today has enough worries of its own. And so, but it's also biblical that his mercies are new every morning. So for that day, you have been given enough mercy and grace for that day. So maybe it needs to just be you reframing your mind from trying to make the next 3-week game plan or the next 6-month game plan. And let's just make today's game plan.
Yeah, that's good. I think of Psalm 5:3, "O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch." I'm going to wake up every day. I'm going to give this day to the Lord. I'm going to sacrifice it to him, and I'm going to walk with him that day and experience the joy that he can provide for me. And the days and the weeks and the months ahead, in particular in suffering, Psalm 131, right? I do not occupy myself with things too high and lofty for me. We cannot chart the course of our life. We can try our best, right? But God knows what lies ahead. Great conversation, Kayla. Thanks for joining me today.
Of course.
You are actually delightful today.
There's a first for everything.
Shocking. Everyone, thanks for joining us. If you haven't subscribed on either YouTube or Spotify, make sure you do that so you never miss an episode. If you haven't signed up for the Daily Dig, you can do that on our website, experienceredemption.com. If you need to get more connected around here at Redemption Church, reach out to Kayla, Kayla, at experienceredemption.com, and she would love to help you. Thanks for joining us.
The Redemption Recap is an extension of Redemption Church. For more information about the church, please visit experienceredemption.com. Thanks for stopping by.